welcome, 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 everybody. What I want to introduce today is really how Spencer and I work with Tritype, with clients, and how it can help us more specifically identify what is needed or to help a client better understand aspects. And for those of you who don't really know the Enneagram, you're new to Tritype. I originally discovered Tritype when I was doing research on the internal experience of type. And I ended up with two bodies of work. The Tritypes and the Tritype stackings, all that came out of that 1994-95 research. And at the same time, I found Tritype. What did I find? Well, I noticed when I was interviewing person after person after person that they had the core fears of three types, not just one. Now, at the time, I already knew core fears from other work I had done prior to learning about the Enneagram. I already knew microexpressions. I already knew body language. I already knew faciology. I already knew archetypes. I knew Myers-Briggs. I knew many, many systems. So when I was doing these interviews, I had a really great opportunity at the first conference, Enneagram conference, to meet a lot of people and get master lists of people that would be familiar with their type. And then my research broadened a great deal rather than the few hundred people that I knew. But what I found is that people consistently had types, and way too many, that were not connected by a wing or a line of connection. So I'm thinking, well, why is this core fear so prevalent, so strong? And because I had developed an in-depth inquiry process to interview people in another context, they would get to these answers very quickly. And they didn't know the clusters of core fears that I did, and neither did other Enneagram people because they hadn't done that research. But I identified the clusters I had found and what type they were, matched some of what was out there and added more. And so if someone, for example, was a 7 and they identified with the fear of being trapped, limited, in some way inferior, etc., that's clear. Look like a 7, sound like a 7, talk like a 7 using the idiomatic expressions that 7s like to use, and so forth. That was fine. And if they had the core fears of 8, that would be fine because it could be a wing type. But when they would have core fears of the 4, there's no connection. 7 has no line to the heart center at all. And obviously no line to 4. So this happened too consistently. So I started just tracking it and asked people, hey, have you noticed this pattern? And a lot of people would just say, yeah, Katherine, I'm not looking at things the way you are, and I'll watch for it. So it took a while before I had enough people that we could confirm their Tritype. I used it with clients because I discovered if there was a dilemma, a struggle that the client was facing, if I worked with all 3 types together and introduced that, they could resolve issues or understand their issues much more rapidly and completely. So I knew there was something to it. And then I had the good fortune of meeting a teacher under the Eureka system, which was Oscar Ichazo's work. And she was doing a presentation on his psychocalisthenics. It wasn't even about Tritype. Originally, I called it Three Types, by the way, and Tricenter. However, while she was giving this little morning event, she mentioned that she was so glad that Ichazo had added the trifix because even though she was a 5, she knew she had the visceral energy, especially when angry, of an 8. And before, she just attributed it to a line of connection. But when he added trifix, that was the fixation of each center, she was able to see why it was so dominant and why in the beginning the 8 and 5 seemed so close for her. Now, Ichazo did all the typings for people, but I just said, wait a minute. Okay, that's someone else, 3 types, 1 from each center. I've found the same thing. And then I asked her if there was any place I could find any information on that. And she said no, that he'd only just recently started telling people their trifix. And so I was lucky enough to also have met Jack and Andrea, who at the time had the Enneagram Monthly. And they had interviewed Ichazo in Hawaii, and their publication on that visit came out in December and January, where there were 2 paragraphs on trifix. I thought, okay, it's really the same. So I thought there's no point in pursuing the name 3 types or tricenter when it already existed in a way, but we just didn't know about it because it was after the original dissemination of the Enneagram. Having said that, my research was based on the whole type. And I didn't fully understand at first that Ichazo only identified the fixation of each type, not the passion, not the conviction, not the dynamics between the type and their wings or their lines of connection. It was just the fixation. So then there was a dilemma because my research had revealed it's the whole type, the whole dynamic aspects of the type. So then it became clear that even though Ichazo and I identified that we use a type from each center, which was very meaningful because at the time that was not known. And 2 and 4 and 5 and 7 were 4 of the 9 types that did not have a line to one center or another. Like the 2 and 4 did not have a line to the head center, and the 5 and 7 did not have a line to the heart center. So I thought this is meaningful because we all use our heart, we all use our head, and we all use our gut. And we use understanding as a way to manage problems. We feel the intuition of our heart when we're feeling connected and bonded to someone, as well as when we feel separate. We feel it in the heart, that movement, the clenching or the expansion of the heart. And we also all use the visceral aspect of our gut to identify ways that we feel obstacles and how we do or don't move to get that obstacle out of our way. And then shortly thereafter, brain science revealed that the head we knew had, that executive function was available in the head. But they came to realize there were brain cells in the heart and brain cells in the gut. And then it made more sense. So these things were kind of evolving simultaneously. So Ichazo had introduced the Enneagram of Personality with proto-analysis, which is what he called it originally, in 1970. Now, he'd been working on concepts with the centers long before that. So much evolved over time, but he did not identify that everyone uses all three centers. But eventually he did. When he referenced the term trifix early on, it was to name the system of three triads. And he called them instinctual triads, by the way. And if you say, wait a minute, that's confusing. Well, Naranjo told me that he was honoring Ichazo's copyright and was using other terms to not interfere with Ichazo's work because he'd been a student of Ichazo and felt like, when I met him, he still felt like a student of Ichazo. So I continued my research. And then as I went through that research and started compiling more and more data using my testing instruments and correlating it with the adjectives, the words, pictures, and phrases that people gave me or sent in, which are the collages you can see. The 9 basic collages are on the website at katherinefauvre.com. But the rest you can find in the Tritype book. But it was fascinating the way they emerged. Now, a friend of mine was extraordinary in creating those first Enneagram maps, and then I just modified them. And she also took the words, pictures, and phrases from those 9 types that pertain to the 27 Tritypes and started the structure. And then I got other pictures from people, and that's what you'll see. So it's the archetypal energy I want you to track, not so much a single word or phrase, but the way they come together. And one of the questions on the Q&A was, how can you be sure you have the right tritype? Are there problems with trityping just the way they can be for the Enneagram types? Yes. The 9 and the 6 will have the same problem determining their tritype that they will their Enneagram type. They're meant to track behavior. It's the way they see the world when they think about something. They're motivated by what they're afraid of, but they don't necessarily know they're afraid because what they've done is found a solution or prepared so they won't feel afraid or they feel less afraid. But they do know that they can run anxiety or they could be teased for worrying or second guess themselves or have doubt. So the main thing I stress with Tritype is that you don't just pick the 3 types that you identify with. You can begin there for sure, but that you take it a step further and find the way you use the defense strategies of the type rather than identification. This is especially hard for the 6 and 9 because they're always adjusting. Another one of the questions was, is there a correlation between tritype, instinct, and autism, ADHD, nonverbal learning disability, synesthesia, and being a highly sensitive person? Absolutely, there are correlations. And you can have ADHD or autism or any learning struggle in all 9 types. It will show up differently. If someone has 5 in the tritype, they'll be less inclined to move towards others. If they have 9, 6, and 2, even if they don't necessarily know how to judge a situation and say the perfect comment, they still will attempt to do that. Graciousness would still be important because the 2, 6, 9 is very focused on being in relationship with you, with their neighbors, with the people, even on the freeway. I always laugh at that one because my mother-in-law had said when she's driving, she's sick, she'd always look at the other cars, see who was in there, and did they seem friendly? And then if there was an accident, she'd know which car to go to. So see how fear can be a motivator. It can direct us. And people underestimate the way shame is a motivator and the way anger is a motivator. And we all have all three. It's just what order do we use them in? Oh, I promised to do a little quickly. This is on my website where you took the test, which is https://Enneagram Tritype test.com. And you can take the test there. And I discuss Tritype on there. And also my other website, KatherineFauvre.com, I've introduced different combinations like blogs or what have you, but they're under the Tritype section. So just for those of you who don't know, and those of you who maybe learned about Tritype from me years ago, but haven't been aware of how it's refined itself, it's that I no longer think of Tritype as just the three centers, and that by knowing your Tritype, you can see how you're different as a three, perhaps, than another three. So 1, 3, like I'm seeing Suzanne has 379. That's the ambassador archetype, Tritype that is trying to include everyone and do fun things, but get things done. It cuts the edges off the 3 in a way. It softens it with a 9. It brings in a playfulness of 7, but there's still a need for completion. Whereas if it's 2, 7, 9, sure, they may like to get things done in their life, but it's not a fundamental need. The greater need is to have easy relating and connecting with others on a more personal level. Whereas the 3, 7, 9 can do that, but they're really focused on the big picture of people. So I'll just give you 2 paragraphs here. Tritype, a 27-point personality system. So even though there are 9 types, Tritype itself is about 27 types. It's based on the theory that we all use 3 Enneagram types, not just one, and these are located in each center. So the dominant type of each center. So the head type, 5, 6, and 7. We have a heart type and 2, 3, or 4, and a gut type of 8, 9, or 1. But what's significant is that these types are used in a preferred, rapidly oscillating order and a descending order. So there's a dominant type, a second type, and a third type. And initially, when I was teaching it, I'd say when the defense strategy of our dominant type isn't working, we're going to go to the other 2 types. But what was misunderstood is that people took it to mean they stopped being their primary type and then shifted, where in reality, they're always just so rapidly spinning that it's really more what the 3 types together amplify and minimize. So if you have my Tritype, which is, if I say it personally, it would be 874. That's the order of dominance for me. But the Tritype archetype is the 478. So when I'm referencing a Tritype itself, it will be from the smallest number, numerical number, to the highest. It's just easier for all of us to communicate. But when we're talking about someone in particular, and in this case, Spencer and I might talk about a client with a particular Tritype or what have you, then we're going to use their Tritype because it is significant, because the lead is still there. So no one loses their primary Enneagram type. You just gain a deeper understanding of all the coping mechanisms you use. So what happens is when these 3 types merge, it creates a new type unto itself, which is why I reference it now as a 27-point system rather than a 9-point system. And each type has a worldview unto itself, its own coping mechanisms based on this amplification or minimization and the defense strategies. Now, originally, as I said, I had just a few hundred people, like 400 people, until I met more people. I just continued with my research. So extensive research with tens of thousands of international participants has confirmed that each tritype archetype has the character traits. Now, I'm not talking about behaviors, although there can be some behaviors that are noticeable, but any type can have a good or bad behavior, or an interest, or a talent, or a skill. So we have to look at the character traits to identify these archetypes, because these traits within the tritype are what emerges when you combine the core fears and the idealized image of each type in the tritype. So with 4, 7, 8, none of these types want to be limited. 4 doesn't want to, 7 doesn't want to, 8 doesn't want to. We all follow our own muse. So if someone has it in their tritype, they may have grown up being told they needed to be more cooperative. But what people don't know is that the 4, 7, 8 is trying to be cooperative, but we're always going to see something that is not included in whatever we're doing. And it's the most future-oriented tritype. It's the most creative tritype, but we have a great deal of trouble staying with something as it is. So I was once asked, like, well, don't you just want to be the person known for the instincts because you did all this research and you're still doing research? But I had already moved on to tritype, and I moved on to micro expressions because I felt, gee, I know these different areas and I wanted everyone to benefit. So that's my experience. Whereas Spencer, as an 846, ENFP, by the way, whereas I'm an ENTP. Okay, Spence, tell me how you experience the 8, the 4, and the 6. I've worked with Spencer, by the way, for 36 years.
I mean, it depends what's happening around me, but I definitely identify as a very emotional being. I want to call things out. That's both my 8 and my 6. My 4 wants authenticity. So the whole adage of the canary in the coal mine is a very accurate statement, because even though I may present as 7 and 9 in a lot of areas, because just for my own personal life, I've learned that 8 can get me in trouble sometimes. So I more disguise it. I call it putting on a costume, because I'm like, hey, this isn't going to come off the way I mean it, so I'm going to say it more like this, and that's how I strategize. But the whole concept of, even if I know it's going to create conflict, if I feel like it's an important thing to say, I still say it because I feel like I need to. It's not like an option. I'm letting people down that I care about. I'm not protecting them, my 8. I'm not preventing some bad thing from happening in the future, my 6. And I'm also not expressing myself authentically. And if something were to happen, I'll always be like, see, you didn't let it be known, and now you never know, blah, blah, blah. And I'm noticing what's missing here with my 4. And not to mention, I don't feel like I'm giving my all to this moment. So you put all that together, it's this combination where it's just like, hey, I want to see the real you, and I really want to feel safe with you seeing the real me. And it's that eternal drive to accomplish that in life with just, everyone I meet. It's not a big deal.
Over and over. And that's what you will feel with your own tritype, or your friends, family members, or clients' tritype, is it feels like mandatory that we do it.
Yeah.
So if you don't really see all facets of yourself, adding obviously the instinctual stacking, because that's what propels it into motion, then you probably don't have it right. Now, Spencer grew up with the Enneagram and was there, as I found, Tritype and more on the instincts. So actually, he was quite mad at me when I was taking a month, thinking, well, if I were a 4, I'd be answering it this way. And then a month, if I were a 7, I'd be answering it this way. And if I were an 8, I'd be answering it this way. But I'd already recognized that all 3 were operating within me. And by doing that, and you can even do it in a week, just think of anything that happens and say, as a 4, a 6, or an 8, then you will find nuances of your defense strategy that you didn't recognize before. So it doesn't mean you won't be the type you thought you were. You'll just learn more about the 3 of them. But when I was doing my month as a 4, Spencer said, wait a minute, we need a match. And we always matched before. Do you remember that, Spence? And anyhow, and I said, well, you have 4 as well. But it took a while for the 6, for the very same reason that 6s have trouble typing, because so much of that 7 and 9 to soften the 8, the intensity of the 8, made it seem very much like he could be 7 in the Tritype. So he could be exactly like me, the way a 3-year-old would want, or a 9-year-old, or 10 by 11. Yeah, that's not needed anymore. So what do you remember growing up, Spence, that your challenges were as a 4-6-8 or as an 8-6-4?
Without a doubt, reactivity. One of the mantras that I very much use to this day is feelings aren't facts, because the amount of times that I felt something and then immediately translated as, oh no, that's what is happening, not my perception, not my this, not my that. Like, no, all people see it this way. And if they don't, they're wrong. Let me help them see it the correct way so I can protect them as well. And that may or may not have led to a couple times where I go, oh, I acted too quickly. I thought this, that's actually what was going on. You know, the whole removing foot from mouth kind of moment. So that was probably the biggest way it showed up, because if something was unfair, I had to say something right away. If I felt like, I don't know, betrayed, I didn't stop to ask questions and be like, was I actually being betrayed? It was just, that is what's happening. So the reactivity for sure.
Yeah, in fact, all 3 types are sensitive to betrayal, but it is the motivator for the 8, the strongest reaction that the 8 has.
Yeah.
So, and I remember that, of course, with you as a child and being a fellow 8. And I wish I had known more about how an 8 can manage the tendency to want to give people the truth. I had an 8 father and an 8 aunt, social 8s though, rather than sexual 8. And they just tell, yeah, just don't take that from anybody. You know, follow the truth. And they didn't say, wait a minute, we don't necessarily have the truth. We have our truth. So I was validated for being an 8 by my father and aunt, but not in the school system when I was in elementary school, because I would just correct the teacher in a direct, impersonal way, and they would take offense. And I don't blame them. Now, I didn't do it all the time, but I seemed not just uncooperative, I seemed like I was difficult. And then when the teacher would say, no, you're wrong. It's this. And then I'd say, well, let's look at an encyclopedia. And of course, they'd hate that. But I had to learn that maybe the textbook that a teacher was teaching from is what we needed to use rather than what I might know. And to go up to her later or privately, any teacher or him, and ask those questions. And the same with people, because the 8, when they're really young, just sees everybody the same. So my Tritype wanted the forward movement, not as focused on the 6 version of justice the way Spencer would have in his Tritype. I'm focused on the movement forward because I have 7 in my Tritype. So what we're going to do now is answer some of these questions that came in. There are quite a few. And if you want to understand more about Tritype, you also want to read the core fears and the idealized images of the type. And I do have that on my site. You could probably even just Google it, because you're going to have all 3 core fears. Like as a 4 in the Tritype, that's a fear of being inadequate, flawed, defective. The 7, fear of being inferior, trapped, missing out. And by the way, they had that fear of missing out before it became a buzz term, like we have it now. People all know, that it was started by a 7, just as awesome was a 7 and hot was a 7 and cool was a 7. They are the head of the moving force within the head center. So they are very focused on hierarchies. And so they're meant to kind of be the leader of their group, not an enforcer type leader, but moving forward, interesting, setting new standards or vocabulary in a way. Other vocabulary emerges as a group, like when we're in school or as a country. All these things come into being. Now with the internet, we've got all kinds of terms and phrases. But Spencer and I will both be happy to answer a question unless he feels more comfortable answering it or I feel I can add something. So you can ask questions. I'll just start with these to get us going. Okay, so continuing with that question, Spencer, with the Tritype and the instinct, the autism, the ADHD, nonverbal learning disabilities, and synesthesia, or the really highly sensitive person. What have you noticed when you're working with people in your practice?
Well, I've noticed what they accentuate. That's probably the easiest way to think of it. 8s who, for example, may already struggle with delaying gratification and impulsivity, while add ADHD, and now we struggle even more with delaying gratification. We struggle even more with impulsivity. We know the emotional reactivity, because since ADHD is such an emotional diagnosis, which a lot of people don't fully connect, since it's so right brain dominant of a diagnosis, it's very emotion centered. And it is motivated through emotion. People with ADHD, they'll actually complete a task due to the anxiety that it's finally due in an hour, right? Or something like that. And so understanding what Tritype they have alongside, for instance, the ADHD, that will tend to intensify certain elements that they have in common. I often call it overlap, but my mom, I like my mom's term better with like the trifocus and things like that, because it's what when they overlap,
triple
you
focus.
have that thing in common. It's just like one magnifying glass, now 2. So it's like a even further intensified thing. So that's really what I've noticed. And same thing with autism or whatever. Like there's something that gets exaggerated even further or minimized because it either cancels out because it's the opposite or it shares that quality.
And we can, in a way, mistype ourselves or others. If we have ADHD, we can think we're a 7. Because so many of the definitions of ADHD include things that we also have identified with 7. So that's really important. And with my experience with synesthesia, now Spencer and I both have ADHD and synesthesia, so we're familiar with these. And if you don't know what synesthesia is in this context, it is that hypersensitivity. And why is that hypersensitivity an issue? Is that we can't stop it until we learn to work with it. If we hear a sound or we smell something familiar or the crackling of the leaves in the every single thing that is tied to a really happy moment or a really upsetting moment, we experience again as though it's happening now. The type that does this the most is type 4. And it's one reason that in the therapeutic settings, it isn't good for the 4 to go into that memory. It's not cathartic. It may seem like it, but it's creating a loop and ingrained structure, like on a record. The more you use a record, the more definite it becomes. So it's not good for them. Just as it's not good for a 7 to make them go into it. You just tell them ahead of time, we're going to touch on these core fears and the experiences associated with them to tag it and then go right back. And I can really do that well with micro expressions, as can Spencer, because Spencer experiencing this over the years. Whatever I learned, he learned. So we can say that it'll show up differently, the synesthesia, but it's omnipresent. Joanne, you have a question?
My question was regarding the instincts, the self-pres, sexual and social, and how I'm new to Tritype, but how they relate. Like, so you have 27 types. Are there now 27 times 3 types?
You get up to the 56. Wait, is it 56? Doing the math. So there's 9 Enneagram types, and there are 9 variations in the Tritype and 9 instincts. And at first it seems overwhelming, but that's just because we don't know how to identify it. Once we get it, it's absolutely easier because we can pick up an important facet. And what is important about the instinct is that it's running the show. When we have an unmet need that feels life-threatening, and by the way, the hindbrain cannot recognize or distinguish between something that seems like a threat and a real threat. So if we go to a scary movie, the brain is still reacting as though you're in that movie and you're being pursued by someone dangerous. So that's why we'll tense up, or even if we think that stuff doesn't bother us, it's still being recorded in the brain. So if you know that the instinct is the triggering force, that unmet need, and the stacking of the instinct is important, but it oscillates just like Tritype. I came up with the Tritype stacking and the Instinctual Stacking at the same time in 1995 because they were related, but I didn't come up with the new concepts till a few years later when I had massive amounts of research. But for those of you who don't know, the instinct alerts us. Like I like what I wanted to do this too, because I had learned this about Aristotle years and years ago, and the Enneagram answered this so perfectly. But Aristotle suggested that true internal harmony could be achieved only when internal conditions allow each aspect of the psyche to perform what it was primitively meant to perform. Now, that's one long comment, but it is what the Enneagram, and in particular the instincts and Tritype, identify. You need to know all those facets. And when you do, you can begin to know how you want to resolve things. It never feels as rigid or stuck, even if there's trauma, by the way, because trauma has to be dealt with as trauma. But if you know someone's type, Tritype, and instinctual stacking, it helps you better work with that trauma in a way that matches the person. So I've supervised a lot of people that specialize in trauma because they want to understand the types and the Tritypes. And it really works. And with people I've worked as well. Does that answer your question at all?
Somewhat, but I guess I was wondering, like, can you maybe share between you and Spencer your instinctual and how that impacts your Tritype?
Yeah. So a spin-off of what Mom was saying. So like 8 to 8, for example, right? So the protectiveness and the need to make it known is there regardless. But your instinct guides you as to where you're putting your foot down. I might, like if I'm not feeling good, I got self-pres last. And I always joke that like the 1 point in self-pres that I got, I answered the question incorrectly. I'm just not self-pres. Like I'm not aware if I'm tired. I'm not aware if I'm hungry. I'm not aware if I'm not feeling well. Like, it's just like, my self-pres 6 wife is just like, what? Like she just doesn't understand like how I can just not be aware of these things. I just don't pay attention.
That's her specialty.
Yeah, exactly. So she's a self-pres 6. And so I'm kind of her like walking nightmare in that area because she's always wondering what she needs to like make sure I'm doing so I'm okay. So if I'm out somewhere, I am sexual, social, self-pres. So if I'm not feeling good, I'm not going to put my foot down that we need to leave, because that's not what's important to me. But if something's coming up, it's going to interfere, like one-on-one time. Hey, we're meeting with these 5 close friends, and I haven't specifically seen Justin in like 5 years. I want to make sure I get specific time with him. I want to make sure to catch up with him. I've seen these other, no offense to them, I've seen them more recently. And if something keeps coming up to where I'm getting interfered with bonding with Justin, my 8's going to be like, like hopefully not right away, but I'll be like, boom, like, hey, I didn't say anything the first couple times, but this is getting in the way. My sexual is going to make my 8 and my 4 and my 6 be like, hey, is anyone seeing this? Because I am. Is anyone going to do anything about this? So it'll activate. So that's what I think my mom means by the instinct runs the show. Because in the end, like, yeah, I was going without my self-pres needs for like a while. But like literally it was crickets to my whole Tritype. They were just like, yeah, I mean, if someone starts dangling food in front of you when you're starving and then teasing you, yeah, I'll speak up because that's just cruel and like not okay. But if it's not that, I'll just kind of leave it alone because that's my 3rd. So it's kind of that's the way to think of it, is like it'll get activated by what's important to the instinct. So if that's getting threatened, all things start firing off. And depending on what's getting threatened, 1, maybe 2, maybe all 3 of your numbers will highly activate over that thing. Not to mention if 2 out of 3 of your instincts are getting activated.
Yeah.
Even more.
As the sexual, social.
Right.
5 close friends are a great example.
Right.
Whereas a sexual self-pres, it'll be 2 close friends. I might have more close friends, but then I'm not as adept at dealing with the social dynamics of that. I like just meeting with one person so we can go deep. And if people really know each other and we could have a single conversation, if we go to dinner and we listen to each person speak and there's no splitting off, because the minute you split off, that's the social domain. Mm-hmm. So if there's just ourselves, we're governing our own time. But if there's another person, the dyad, we can create more depth. It feels safer to us. But 3 people can still be a part of the sexual instinctual domain because there's no other person to split off to. But once there are 4 people, this is when the sexual starts to go crazy if they're not all together. Like if 2 start talking and then 3 are talking over here, it torments the sexual because if they're all their friends, they want to hear that conversation as well. And you've all had this experience, but what Spencer's addressing is that as a sexual 8, that's everything to us. The people we are close to, that we are going to fight for and go the distance no matter what, we want that to be in harmony. And that's our 9 wing. We want to do interesting things and move forward and be excited and have diversity of the 7. But the 8 is trying to manage that. How does the need for the 1 and the closeness interact with the need to be absolutely autonomous? And it's one of the countertypes. So there's one stereotype in each type, and therefore tritype. And there's 2 countertypes in a way that it goes against the need. But if we look at the self-pres 8, those match up just fine. 8 wants their stuff, and self-pres wants their stuff, and are to tend to their body and their stuff. That works fine. But the sexual has this need to surrender control to the person that is devoted to them. So they're in search of the person they're devoted to that's mutually devoted to them. And then they can show more of their vulnerability, who they are, and so on. The social has a problem as well. They're another countertype because they're using people to create associations and alliances and friendliness to be able to have a rapport to meet their needs. So if someone happened to be an 8 and they were also self-pres 2nd, they would act one way. But if it's sexual self-pres, then it gets more complicated because, wait, do you focus on the 1 or your needs and your stuff? Well, the social is then bringing in all these alliances, but it's a conscious intent to say, okay, I'll do this for you, but you got to do this for me. It's kind of like the mafia, if you think about that. Okay, I'll make these alliances. But the other way that the social 8 can be running is, hey, if I know enough people and I'm an extroverted 8 and I have all these relationships, when I need to do something or get something, I'm going to know someone who'll give me a deal or make sure I get the right thing or the right information, because the 8 doesn't want advice, but they do want people that they respect and trust to answer a question they might want answered. Okay, so it makes a huge difference. That was a great question. Really great question. Thank you for asking it. Have I answered it enough?
Yeah, those were great examples. Thanks.
Good. Okay, Becca.
Hi. So going back to the conversation about, if there are correlations between the Enneagram and ADHD, autism, and being a highly sensitive person. And Spencer was talking about how certain things in the tritype get amplified or intensified. And so mine is kind of like a 2-part question. So the first part is, well, what about situations where you have like one of these things, but like like you have like a counter tritype. So like, for example, let's say you have ADHD, but like your tritype is 136, which is very much opposite of of ADHD.
It's organized and structured. And go ahead. Say more.
Yeah. And so so I was wondering if you and Spencer could like touch on what happens if it's like a counter tritype. And then also just I'm also wondering if like,
Because she wanted to hear from both of us.
ADHD and the 631.
Yes.
So the question was, what specifically about that combo?
Well, she sees it as a counter tritype. It's actually not a counter tritype, but that tritype in this instance is counter to having ADHD. Now, what becomes important is whether you're introverted or extroverted. And when you're introverted, it's ADD, not ADHD. The H is really the extroversion or the physical, like kicking, or like you might see my table go up and down sometimes, or I'm moving too much. It's the need to move. Now, if you're a body type, that's going to show more. But if you're a head type, and you appear to be, and if you know you're 6, that's amazing and wonderful. But in the self-pres, 621 in particular has rigidity, but a 631 has rigidity in a different way. The 621 is trying to do and manage situations in a way that feels right. 126 is very militant when they need to be. But if you have ADD, you can get lost in your thoughts. And what a lot of self-pres 6s with ADD tell me is that they could be really smart, or they could think they're dumb, or stupid is the word the 6 will use, because they can be distracted by something, but their energy is not big. It's just more internally. So when you have internal ADD, it's like a version of a hamster in the mind, the way the extroverted ADHD types kind of move or push. So, for example, I'm looking out my window right now. And when I was in elementary school, I'd always look out the window. And if there was a lawnmower, the guy seated on the lawnmower, driving around, mowing the grass, first the noise would attract my attention. And then I would start noticing, well, why is he going that way? That's not the best way to cut grass. And I'm thinking, well, what would I be doing? I'd be cutting it this way. So I didn't like his pattern of the way he was driving the little lawnmower. And then that whole time I was evaluating that, there was a subject matter being discussed, and then I'm called on, right? But if you're introverted and you have the ADD, you're feeling that hamster and you're distracted by your, especially 6, your fear that you could be afraid, or that you might not have the answer, that you could be called on. And what are you going to do? So it's very frustrating. Some people with ADD daydream, because if they miss something and they're out of sync with what's going on in the classroom, then the mind wanders and then they miss things. So even though they're not necessarily watching the lawnmower, they're still active. And when my kids had ADHD, my first son, my boys are 9 years apart, I thought, there's something to know about this. And I researched it as deeply as I've done the Enneagram and many other systems. But what I found is it's the point of overwhelm. Like, what is the tipping point for each person based on their Enneagram type, Tritype, instinct, Myers-Briggs, however many systems you want to put together, that they lose the ability to be in sync in a way that they need to be in a classroom when things are not paced like the person with ADD or ADHD. And that it's learning how to manage the overwhelm that does the most. And if you don't know someone's tritype, it's really hit or miss. Whereas I knew my kids really well, and they obviously got the ADHD from me, but they had the benefit of a mother that knew many systems before I had kids. And then I researched what it was with ADD. And so much of what they were teaching about ADD did not recognize introversion, extroversion, different worldviews, because people didn't know the Enneagram, certainly not in that world. And sometimes people couldn't recognize the way to work with their ADD or ADHD because what was out there was not based on their particular type or tritype or instinctual type. Like a social that has ADD is going to get really revved up if they feel that they're not aligned with the people they care about, that they feel are a part of their group. Whereas a self-pres won't be as disturbed by that, but they might be disturbed by being thirsty, not being able to go get a drink of water. So they may just carry their stuff. Or self-pres with ADD may just trust that it'll show up. So I find it extraordinarily helpful with all of these qualities, like someone that has Asperger's. They could have a tritype that makes them not really care about communicating with others. Or again, like I said earlier, with the 268, they might very much want to communicate with others, but have a fear that they will say something they shouldn't. And then be embarrassed because that social need could be so strong. Does that make sense? So it's all of it. And that's why if you put it together, it gives a really effective way of narrowing down to exactly what might be needed. And the more systems you know, the better. Actually, it's one of those things where you just have more tools in your toolbox. Does that answer your question at all?
Yes, absolutely. The other part of it, though, well, this is, I guess, kind of like my theory, and I'd love your perspective on it. Is I also think that, yeah, well, I guess, yeah, like what you were saying, because it sounds like what you're saying is that like your tritype can change the manifestation of, ADD, ADHD, or autism.
It changes the perception and it shows up in a different way, but they're always both there. Are we saying the same thing? Because change is not a word I like to use with things that are permanent. Like if you have ADD or ADHD, it's lifelong. They didn't know that originally, but it is. Same with the Enneagram. Originally, it was thought that it was based on nurture. And they found, no, it's nature. We're born with these tritypes and types, but they weren't always necessarily recognized. But that energy was already going on. And the way they come together will shape, I like the word shape, the expression of the dilemma, the learning disability, any of these patterns. I'm sorry, I just said, let's not use the word change, but I threw you off track there. Go ahead and give me your theory.
Maybe like, maybe theory is the wrong word, but just more of like this is a specific example that I don't know, but like with the like ADHD, and if your tritype is 621 or 631, like psychologists who study like ADHD, like say that, people who have ADHD like are low on the personality trait conscientiousness, which I disagree with because
I
people
disagree with it as well.
Yeah,
yeah, because like there are 621s and 631s out there who have ADHD, and there's different facets of conscientiousness. So like I would think that the 621 and the 631 are probably high on the dutifulness and like orderliness aspects of conscientiousness, but perhaps they're low on and they're also maybe high on like the cautious facets of conscientiousness, but there may be but maybe they're lower on self-discipline, achievement striving, or self-efficacy. But because the one is in the tritype, and in the case of like 631, maybe they like, I don't know, like maybe they come up with accommodations, for themselves.
Yeah, adaptations. That's just where I was going to respond to you. Absolutely. And the adaptations are very meaningful. And then sometimes people will say, well, how does IQ play into this? Well, you just kind of figure out ways you can manage the issue younger. That's all. Where it might take people with an average IQ a little longer to do that. But for example, I wasn't confirmed that I had ADHD till I brought my son in when he was 7. And when I saw the way he was being tested, and he was being tested for everything, I go, well, I have that problem. But I just do this. And that's what you do. And you'll do it based on your tritype. So the 1, 3, 6 and the 1, 2, 6 will figure out a structure that will help them track the things they lose track of. Whether you set alarms on your phone, or like when I'm coaching, I don't send the invitation ahead of time because things change. And in my experience, maybe we moved the appointment and now it's set and I didn't change the invitation. There are problems. So the way I manage that is to send out the link at the time of the session, maybe a few minutes before, a few minutes after, but at the time. And then a lot fewer mistakes, or time zones really can spin in my brain. And what I do with that is I ask everyone to give me times in my time zone. And then I won't make mistakes. But a lot of people with ADHD have a type of dyslexia or dysgraphia or dyscalculia where you reverse numbers, or you reverse things or skip lines because of the way the brain is trying to see so much at once. What I found is that people with ADD and ADHD are the hunters, and those that don't are the farmers. They're methodical. You till the soil, you plant the seed, you water it, you do whatever you need to step by step. Where people with any form of ADD are the ones that are noticing the broken leaf. They're trackers. And if you have 6 as well, master trackers, where you're just noticing the slightest change. And if it's something that you enjoy, then it's a type of micro focus versus macro focus, and micro focus are different, like playing a video game. For example, people with ADD and ADHD can be really adept at it because they're always seeing changes naturally. So they'll pick up those patterns really fast. Someone else might understand the instructions better at the beginning, because people with ADD see through questions and then they question the question because they know a way in which it doesn't apply. So it's a giftedness, but it's just not the way our school systems run or the way organizations run, unless they're put into a position that matches their tritype, instinctual type, and their perceived disability. And by the way, it's only a disability from the standpoint of what's the most common way of doing things, if that makes sense. So anybody can have some of the traits of ADD or ADHD, or you can have many of them. And then you break those down. If you really study ADD and ADHD, a lot of people don't realize it could be demand lag for one person. It could be right left for another, and on and on. And it's the cluster of those that are very individual. And then once you know what they are for you, you can make those changes even better, how you manage it. Would you say something different, Spence?
Well, I guess the way that I would just kind of focus on it is I would really check in with, in this case, we're talking about ADHD and 126 or 136. Self-doubt and shame will play a role with ADHD and this tritype at the same time, because the ADHD is going to make you forgetful, which is going to increase your self-doubt that you already have. ADHD's forgetfulness can also result in you not following through on something you said you would do for someone else, which would activate your two. And not to mention, you're not doing what you should be doing, what everyone else should be able to do. So you should too. So you'll should yourself to death based on your one. So what I would really focus on is, what is the diagnosis, whatever diagnosis we're talking about, how is it directly slapping your tritype in the face? That's going to be your inner conflict. That's going to be the struggle. And that's the area to create strategies around. So, okay, well, I know I'm going to have forgetfulness. I know it's going to increase my self-doubt, and there's a chance I'm not going to follow through, and I'm going to beat myself up for later because I should have done better. And that whole thing, that's going to happen. I call that time travel. Future you is going to be like, I wish I blah, blah, blah in the past. Well, you're currently in the past of the future self. Enact those things that could prevent what you at least can see coming. And obviously, whatever's left over will be the surprises. And hopefully we adjust well to the surprises. But that's just ADHD. Any diagnosis, how does it slap your tritype in the face? That's where your focus should go, because that's that counter type that you're referring to. I think that's what you're referring to. And so I would put the focus.
Tritype. She was just thinking that they're incompatible. And
it's just going to piss you off. That's what it is. You want to be structured. You want to be this. You want to be that. And your ADHD will get in the way of that. And it's like, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And then whatever processes you engage in because of your upbringing, because of your tritype, because of all that stuff that make it so it'll be harder for you to correct this is the path that you're going down that's only going to make it harder to redirect. Self-forgiveness is a really big element of ADHD. Did you mean to do that? No. Did it happen? Yes. So what can we do about it? Because all this is, this thing I tried didn't land the way I intended. So it's not about like the messages we've gotten our whole lives where we didn't think something through, or we didn't this. It's all about what we didn't do, right? But the truth is, it's like, no, we're thinking about this differently. And I didn't see that way, or I didn't know you'd respond this way. And it's just a corrective based on what the diagnosis directly conflicts with the tritype.
Yeah. And I would say that with, slap in the face is the way an 8 would say it.
My apologies.
For other types, it might be a dis-ease or an anxious feeling, but it is, from an 8's point of view, what kind of interferes with being strong. So if an 8 has ADHD, then they're afraid it shows a weakness.
Yeah.
They don't want to be weak. If a 6 has ADHD, they're afraid it's going to show their insecurity, and they don't want that. So whatever your fear is of your type and your tritype, those three together, more importantly, and your instinct is how it's going to show up. Mm. That's a great question, Becca. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Nicole, what's your question?
Well, it was one question. And then you two geniuses started talking and answering other questions, which of course leads to more questions. Okay. Question. is in relation to what the topic we just covered. Will the orientation to time affect one's ability? Spencer, you were talking about recognizing the cycle, and you sort of talked about forecasting the cycle. But if you are a 4 dominant, 5 dominant, or 9 dominant, and your time orientation is in the past, you see, will that? Well, of course, it will affect. Oh. But you guys experience what effect has that had in helping persons to, what practices would be helpful to persons like that in being able to shift so drastically. I would even say, 1s, 6s, and 2s would even they would have an easier time. But my beloved 4s, 5s, and 9s, it's so difficult.
I want to say something that's not necessarily understood about the 4, 5, 9 as a tritype individually.
No, just as dominant types. But if you wanted to make that a tritype, that would be fun as well.
They may be like, take the 4. They may be focused on the past things that troubled them, the past things where they felt shame, but they also focus on the past happinesses. It's more of a struggle of not being in the present, because the 4 also goes to the future and what it could be like and what it should be like and an ideal future. So they do have the future in them. Where they struggle more is in the present. And the 5 is focused on managing the way they hold in too much. They're like overly self-contained, that they would sacrifice their arm to be free rather than sacrifice their way of thinking or doing things. So they might be avoidant as a defense strategy, but they're looking towards the future. And the same with the 9. But the 9 defense strategy is a form of denial, but it's doing something to make them feel better. Narcoticizing, sleeping, eating, getting an ice cream cone, talking to a friend, whatever it is the 9 likes to do to get out of the painful feelings. Because 9s, all gut types, have the fear of shame and grief and of paranoia, all at the same time, chaos. Because the gut type is the integration of the 3 centers. So the heart types are focused on shame and grief, avoiding them. And the head types are focused on fear and paranoia. So just by virtue of that, it's a single focus. It's powerful, but it's singular. Whereas gut types, it's all merged together. And that's why gut types get overwhelmed and resist, push away, push back, and want to have control of their environment and domain because they're flooded. Now, any person can be flooded, but those gut types are managing feeling flooded all the time and finding that singular thing that they need to do to get out of their overwhelm. Whereas the head types do that to get out of their chaos, and the heart types do that to get out of their emotional reactivity. So I think with the 4, 5, 9, I've worked with many of them. And one of the most important things for them to learn is that they manage the distress, especially if they have ADD or any kind of learning disability or assessing, evaluating, whether it doesn't really matter what it is. They are going to feel overwhelmed when they don't know where they're headed. So that's the past orientation you're talking about. So they would rather, it's an introverted tritype too, the 459. But all three types have a type of arrogance. The 4 is arrogant about their language abilities and their thing they do really well. And the 5 is focused on their ability to conceptualize and look at the big picture and the little picture and put them together. But both know they have other insecurities that is not easy to manage. So 5, it's that retentiveness. Like if you're really holding back and retentive, you're not in the moment. You're trying to manage your world to such a degree that you try to manage yourself. So the 5 becomes very retentive. The 4, on the other hand, feels the shame of emotional displays that erupt when a core fear has been triggered. And the 9's arrogance shows up in the way they have pride, that they have no pride. So 9s at first don't realize that they have ways in which they're doing what all types do, but they're more identified with their humility, and it's a defense of not knowing. So the arrogance around the 9 is, I don't have that problem. I just am easygoing. I just get along with everyone. But as we all know, they can suffer too with feeling overlooked and unseen. But the worldview of the 9 is that you have to go along to get along. But are they still really prideful about the things they do well? Absolutely. Are they aware that they're doing it? Absolutely not. So when you have the 3 together, you begin to see how the 459 can have this kind of arrogance as a defense strategy, as a way to manage the overwhelm of not knowing how they will be in the future. But anyone that has felt shame will always be afraid it'll happen again and try and organize things so it won't. So with ADD, that's pretty darn hard. So the only future idea, the forecasting that you're referencing, is I might show that at a time when it will hurt me. I will be seen as less than, and it will be according to the way the tritype evaluates that. So helping them understand time in general, the way they do the past, the way they do the future, and how it's hard for them to be in the present. And because they're all withdrawn as a defense strategy, it's intriguing because the 4 is the withdrawn type in the moving towards center. So that's why there's the push-pull. And then in the 5, it's the avoidant type in the avoidance center. So they're really going to pull away unless they're social and they have a gift that they want to share, they'll overcome it. But they will know they're smart or they're competent. They just will be less inclined to show it unless there's an argument going on and the 5 has knowledge other people don't, and then they might say something. And then the 9 also, they're in the aggressive center, but they are the withdrawn type in the aggressive center. So they have that going on too. So all these qualities that you can discover through understanding the types at a deeper level are all wonderful. And relationship to time is a great point to bring up because types do have a relationship to time. And it can become quite specific with the tritype as to how that operates. Some types can be so locked into a past shame that they can't move into a future experience. They'll just avoid that type of experience if they felt shame. If you felt shame when you were at the grocery store or you felt fear, you're going to avoid it in the future because you're going to try and forecast that you're safe in the world. Does that make sense? It's just hard being like, okay, let's just go to the grocery store and see if we're going to feel that way again.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. While I have your ear, I will drop these two at the same time so that others can have a turn in, but that made a lot of sense. Thank you. I'll be writing notes on that all night. This is some crazy.
And I'll put them in a block for others. Yeah.
Please do, because not all of us have the gift for all of that.
Yeah.
So, but my first question I had before all of this wonderful stuff started dancing through my synapses. Do the instincts oscillate through the type, the core types in your tritype, the way that as a tritype you oscillate through? So, I'll use myself as an example.
Go ahead.
For the sake of being compliant, I wrote self-pres, sexual, and socials. I was asked, it doesn't matter what test I take. It doesn't matter how much introspection I do. How many times I've bounced it off of wiser ears who've known me for years or what have you. I keep coming up that my self-pres and my sexual, if those jokers, they run neck and neck, and I have self-observed when I switch one off and pick the other one up. And in some observation that I did with myself in very specific environments, like you said, oscillating through the type, this is not the place to be an 8, Nick. Don't do it here.
That's like what Spencer was saying, when I'm teaching at the Federal Reserve Bank, that's not the place to show my flippant nature until I realize that the head of the bank is an 8.
Right, exactly. But I would notice that with the oscillation, at times there would be a movement, or more accurately, a rising. Yeah, I think that's better. A rising of another instinct to say, let me guide this.
Yes. So here's the thing. When I first was doing this in 94, 95, I thought, wouldn't it be just very meaningful and elegant if we had an instinct with each type? So I would be sexual 8, I'd be social 7, and I'd be self-pres 4. Now, at an advanced level, that is true and does work. But what I found instead is the dominant instinct is so pervasive that the stacking became important. Now, when I learned about the Enneagram, the belief was there weren't books out. There was only one book, and most people didn't know about it. But it didn't go into a lot of the material that later became available anyhow. But I did have the notes from Kathy Spieth, who was Naranjo's girlfriend. For those of you who don't know, they were in a study group created by Naranjo after he had spent 8 months with Ichazo in Arica, Chile. He went there and started working with Ichazo, and then stayed and did 5 months of the 10-month training that is so famous now, the July 1st, 1970 training that introduced the Enneagram as, to a degree, as we know it today. Now, obviously, they have taken different paths, and my focus is to bring them back together, because Ichazo came up with some phenomenal things, and some of his changes were equally phenomenal, as did Naranjo. Subtypes are from Naranjo, not Ichazo, even though they were attributed to Ichazo. They don't use subtypes at all in Arica. They didn't even know about it. So when I met the Aricans, when I lived on Maui for a year, they go, no, what? We don't do that. It's never taught that. So you want to just look at it in terms of what came from where and what belief, but the instinct is all pervasive. What have you noticed, Spence?
About what aspect?
Yeah, her question. Will you ask it again, Nicole, in terms of the instinct?
In simplest terms, do the instincts oscillate throughout our tri-type centers the same way that we in ego and in personality oscillate through the dominant types themselves? So just how we oscillate through the numbers.
Yeah.
Say one thing first, Spencer, just to add to your answer, is that what I really liked from Ichazo is that the head types had the practical ego, the how-to. The gut types had the historical ego, remembering things in a physical way. And the heart types had the relational ego, the ego that was based on their connection to others. And they were called conservation for the gut and then relation for the heart. And originally syntony for the head types, but he changed it to adaptation, just for those of you who don't know that. So Spencer, go ahead and answer any way you want.
Yeah, I mean, I always like to still think from the dominant headspace that, your primary number still has major influence, your primary instinct has major influence. But a lot of times I totally feel that situation or time of life or whatever the case may be, something might get activated more. I like to use the phrase costume. Like when my 4 comes out, it is an 8 wearing a 4's costume. Like I am still an 8, but I am acting out the things and demonstrating the things that are important to my 4 because that's what's getting hit right now, and vice versa. And so I view the instincts similar. That I can't imagine a time where they oscillate to the point where social is more important than my sexual. However, I will recognize I am in a party. This is a social atmosphere. So you will see my social 846 way more clearly in that environment. I imagine as I get, more and more, older and, like I'm already aware of like my back stuff that's activating my self-pres, and I'm becoming more and more aware of that, and it's being more and more prioritized. But at the same time, my belief still is, and this might change, is if all 3 were to go wrong at the same time, I would still take care of them in a certain order. I will not be able to think straight until things with my wife are okay.
That's it. Thank you.
Once that's taken care of, I will then deal with how this has impacted my multiple groups. And then when that's okay, it's like, when's the last time I slept? When's the last time and so I will take care of it in that order. So yes, there's an oscillation based on environment, but if all 3 are activated, that's not oscillating for me. It's still like, I can't even think about this until I handle my sexual stuff. And then I can't even think about the self-pres until the social is knocked out, and boom, 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 and so on.
So when you have 2 really close, they're almost like, chromosomes. You use them in pairs, but one is still in the lead.
Okay.
And if we think they're the same, then there's something that could be innate to our tri-type that we don't see. Mm-hmm. So you have the same tri-type as Spence. So you 2 will really be able to language things in the way that you won't need translation. And if you have self-present sexual close, it could be either because the gut types are already self-pres oriented, wanting their comforts, their ease, all gut types. But if you can't really have that ease, if you're off with your intimate relationship and you lead with the sexual, which is what I do, I'm going to sacrifice my physical needs for that relationship. I'm going to need to talk right away with the person that I'm out of sync with that matters to me.
Okay.
Thank you for your question. Hi, Abby.
Hi, Katherine. I had a question about, you mentioned you work with trauma in a way that addresses the instinctual tracking. And you also mentioned certain types not wanting, that it's counterproductive to go into the past. So I was wondering if you could share some of your...
Over and over again. You can go into other facets of the past, just not the same thing. And 4s and people that are highly sensitive or have 4 and 6 in the Tritype will tend to either tear up if that's their defense strategy, or get angry if that's their defense strategy, when they even remember that issue. So I say that they're struggling with synesthesia. So it's much better to just tag it and get them out of it so that you can discuss it over here. If they stay in it, yeah, it might seem like it's a good thing, but it's not, especially for someone like you that has 4 and 6 in the Tritype. It makes it feel real again in the moment. It makes you feel more out of control, more uncertain. I don't recommend it as a pattern. I think it's better to look at what needs to be integrated. And once we've really worked with a traumatic experience, we don't need to hurt like that ever again. But if there's a part of it that we have to touch on to be able to see a way to recover or gain a piece of yourself back, it's got to be very short, just a few minutes, rather than a session on it. The session can be on how to manage that pain. Because traumas are like deeply embedded in our physical, mental, and emotional nature.
And something about the instinctual tracking, working in a way that addresses the instinctual tracking?
Absolutely. Because we will record the trauma according to our instinct. That's the center it'll be recorded in, primarily. And Spencer, how do you work with trauma? According to, now she's your Tritype again too, only leading with 6.
I just focus on the focus because, trauma is hard on any type, any Tritype. It's a trauma. In psychology, we have these things called little t, big T, which means is it a big trauma or a little trauma? And how bigly or smallly, and I know neither one of those are real words, but I'm just going with it. We respond to these said traumas. But depending on the Tritype, I will focus on what that trauma is activating specifically, right? So for 6, the trauma of it happening again, right? Like this being an indicator that this is going to repeat. 6s need a system that they can trust, that is foolproof, and they're constantly seeking that certainty. So the trauma is going to activate. Well, how do I know this isn't going to happen again?
That's
right. The 4 is going to remember the wounding, and it's going to go right back. Like there are certain types, 4 is very, just like, even if it's not full on PTSD, like 4 will experience things very similar, where it's like, and I'm right back there. It is just as real now as it was 2 weeks ago. And it could almost feel terrifying to see the person that they're talking to recognize it as 2 weeks ago while you're in the moment again. So that trauma gets very activated. And then the 8, we can't protect, we can't prevent, we can't, what action can we engage in to just like make this not happen if it's from the past? This is going to reveal my vulnerability again. This is going to this is going to that. So for your Tritype specifically, that would be the approach. And I would also throw in your self-pres. Was there a need that was prevented access to? Did you lose a lot of money? Did you have to starve? Did it lead to a lot of sleep deprivation? Like, what is that trauma actually activating for you? And then I will focus on that specifically. Any of the boxes that I mentioned, you're allowed to check all of them, all the way to one of them, or obviously none of them. But my guess is that, trauma is activating something very specific. Because I could take a water balloon, throw it on the ground. All of us in the Zoom can be looking at it and all have different experiences. So it's all about perspective, really.
What I would add to that is that you look at the core fear of each. So the core fear of the 8 is being powerless. So if your trauma was a scenario where you were disempowered or controlled, and then your 6 was frightened by the trauma in a particular way, it's recorded in the brain. And then your emotional feelings about it, like, am I somehow responsible or not? I mean, that's what the 6-4-8 will do with it. And self-pres, it will be felt really vividly in the body. Even though you lead with 6, that self-pres wins over the 6 because it's more primal, more unconscious.
Right.
Great question, Abby. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sarah?
Yeah, it kind of does have to do with the same question that Abby asked.
Okay.
Well, I obviously have the same tritype.
I was about to say.
Except, I'm a bit confused about the instincts. I mean, growing up, I was a very different person. I resemble a different tritype. But my natural instincts and my natural personality really kind of comes out to the 6-8-4.
What other tritype did you masquerade as?
9-4-6, 6-2-8, 6-2-9.
And did it vary according to who you were with or certain age?
Well, it was kind of who I was with and my place in life. And some of it, I think, had to do with trauma as well. A lot of the 6-2-9 had to do with trauma.
Yeah, trauma disrupts the natural order of our access to solutions. It kind of just blows out all the resources that we would have if we had trust and security. The minute that's undermined, it's chaos, it's scattered. It could be like white noise or white sound. Like if you try to think about something, you have to let in all the stuff you don't want to think about to get an answer to something you do need to think about. So with 6, it's very normal, 6 and 9, to come from the perspective of other types, other tritypes. But that's a defense strategy of 6 to avoid fear.
Yeah, I do avoid fear a lot.
So you haven't really changed your tritype. What it is you're hiding behind another way of being to feel safer in the world.
Yeah, that's exactly the way I was. I mean, I was a very compliant person. I was very 9-ish and very 2-ish, but I actually did mistype myself as a 9 before I found I was a 6. You were the one that made me think I might be a 6.
I love my 6s. I really do. That's why I spent the extra money to program that stuff in.
Sorry about that.
I was just going to say, some people say, why are you so fixated on 6s? And I guess I am fixated on helping them type in a short amount of time rather than discovering 10, 20 years later their true type after they've gone through a bunch of them. So yeah, I do really care about you guys because you will determine your type based on what you identify with rather than what you actually use as a defense strategy.
Yeah. So I'm like, I'm looking at all the stuff on 9. It's like, this is not right. I'm a very emotionally reactive person, and I'm very hypervigilant, and I kind of have two sides of myself. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm not the go I want to get along.
The 6 is the opposing force. The heart center, which 3 is the center of that, is the initiating force. And 6 is meant to be oppositional. Not in a negative way. That's only when the 6 is hurt. But the 6 is calling off whatever's needed to have balance again. 3, 6, and 9 are trying to create balance. The only reason why 3s don't have as much trouble as 6 and 9 is that, boy, they know they're driven. They know they have to be in first place, the best. So it's easier for them to recognize the 3, but they can have trouble with their secondary and tertiary type in their tritype.
Yeah, what I'm struggling with is the instinctual variants, mostly.
And the way you would know that as a 6-4-8, I will turn it over to Spencer, because just coming from the same tritype, he'll language things in a way that will really land.
Yeah.
Spence, what would you say would be good advice in terms of being the 6-8-4 and recognizing which instinct is in the lead?
Well, I mean, again, I envision if they were to all be being activated at once, what would I need to prioritize to move on to the next one? My groups of friends have always been really important to me. Don't get me wrong. But my intimate partner has always taken up more of my focus. And of my friends, my best friend has taken up more of my focus. So in the end, I know what I'm focused on, because if it was everything going off at once, what would I need to address first? So a lot of times these things can be blended. Social and sexual can easily be blended because they have to do with interaction and connection with others. And as a fellow sexual social, I can really, really connect to that. And for me, as someone who doesn't want to break plans, break deals, things like that, when I did, why was that? Right. And I learned from my high school days, to the chagrin of my friends, they would bring to my attention I always chose my girlfriend over them. So that was brought to my attention very quickly that I was in fact sexual, because if I was more social, it would be like, hey, why don't you come along with me and we all could. The more the merrier. Let's make it this big thing. Let's make it so everyone can be there. Or I would have my certain groups and want to keep them separated if that was the social approach I was taking. But for me, it was like, I don't want to upset this. How do I protect this? I'll put this to the side. I've since learned to blend it, but high school and middle school were very, very helpful times for me, because back in that black and white thinking time of age where you couldn't find a compromise between the two, it was what I leaned more towards. And that stays the same, in my opinion, our whole lives. Yeah. Our circumstances might force us to prioritize something else, which is what I was explaining to Nicole. But in the end, if all things are represented fairly and equally, and they're all getting activated at once, which one do you go to first?
Yeah.
That's where observing behavior helps a 6. Once they've typed themselves properly, you can begin to recognize your triggers based on your reactive behavior.
Yeah. And when you're trying to figure this out, Sarah, really eliminate it depends.
Oh God, that's hard for me.
Really eliminate that, because that's why you're bouncing back and forth. Well, except if this was going on and this was going on, then I would this. But then at the same time, if that was going on, I go back to this. This is a way that helps you make decisions because you're weighing both options. But this isn't it depends. They're all being represented equally.
Yeah, I think they are being represented equally.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Pattern. I want to just say this. There is a stair-step pattern with stacking order of your instincts and your tritype. And this is where identification can matter. Because if you're negatively identified with a type in your tritype or an instinct, because you've had very painful experiences in life, that is nurture.
Yes.
So it's always nature and nurture.
Katherine, I have another question about that.
Sure.
I have I've had a lot of painful experiences with in my schooling. A lot of it had to do with social stuff. I had a lot of social rejection, and I never wanted to be rejected.
No, of course. No one does.
And I don't usually like to say this online, but I've never had a significant other, and I don't like that.
How about
I might be anti-sexual.
How about
or negative?
you ever have a significant friendship?
I do, but I've had one significant friendship, maybe two.
Yeah, the thing is that if you look under sexual on the chart I made in the 80s, I still use it to this day. And I think it's on one of the websites. But there's abstinence and promiscuity. And really what that means is there's a dichotomy between the instinct itself. So if you're looking for the one and you haven't met the one and you've been traumatized in school years, can continue on to, by the way, but if you have by bullying or something of that nature, and especially being a female, if you've been bullied by females that spread rumors and undermine, that's how girls do it. And it's to establish a hierarchy. You're not going to feel safe with just anybody.
No,
So
I don't.
That's why you have to put it together.
I don't feel safe with very many people at all.
But it could be that your social's in the lead, and that your social is antisocial because of the trauma.
Oh my gosh. That's something I've never really thought of that, but it could be true.
And we can be anti with any type or any instinct. So we can be positively identified, negatively identified, or neutral. So, for example, I have social last, but I'm not negatively identified with. I like people. I just want that close time more. But you have to meet people to have interesting. And then this is where Myers-Briggs comes into play too. The ISFP is a very sensitive person.
I am a very sensitive person.
Yeah, so that might be a lot of what's going on too. And you have to factor that in as you develop the strategies to manage life. And there's all kinds of things I could go into, and maybe we should do another one of these, because therapeutically we can give a lot of resources. Spencer's got his master's. Annie grew up with the Enneagram. Annie did research with the Enneagram and conflict.
The one thing that I do want to throw out that's a very therapeutic element, especially when you have 6 and 4, and honestly 8 just makes this more difficult. The thing that I just want to throw out there, and I know this is going to hit for probably a lot of people in general, but I just want to remind people, trust is one of those weird things that is only earned by being given before it's earned. Unless we're thinking of one of those PG-13 movies where you're about to walk around the corner and someone's defending your honor and they don't know that you can hear them. And you're like, oh man, this person has my back. And like, that really, really clicks with you. That's someone earning your trust without you giving it to them first. Any other instance, if we know someone can keep a secret, it's because we gave them a secret to keep and then they did.
Which instinct is this?
Well, I mean, in general, this is human beings, but for 6 specifically, I wanted to bring this up because 6 is a life goal to achieve certainty, which isn't something that's truly accomplishable. And I think the 6 struggles with that because certainty has way too many variables, just way too many variables. Like if you keep everyone away from you, then and it's only just you, there's increased certainty because you have control over yourself. We can influence others. We cannot control others. And others influence us as much as they might want to control us.
I have another question. Quickly, with the avoidant types in the avoidance center, aggressive center, withdrawn, whatever you said about 4, 5, 9 earlier, I've never heard any of this.
No, people don't know it. It came from my research and early in my research, and then years of applying it with people. And I have things like this for all the tritypes, things that are not known. But once you know them, you can't unknow them. Mm-hmm. And whatever that thing is, that is our blind spot or spots, it helps us kind of reassess and have a solution that's more viable, or what to do when we're triggered, if that makes sense.
And I got what does an a negative sexual look like?
You don't see
a connection,
a relationship, a deep bonded relationship, because sexual is like, it's like opening the kimono to your internal world. Yeah. You're allowing people to see your vulnerability, but they have to do it equally. And if they don't, the sexual's not going to go for it. Mm-hmm. At least not for long.
When the closer you are, the worse it feels, or the scarier it feels, that should let you know. Because normally for a sexual subtype, the closer it's getting, the more we could drop our defenses, because maybe, just maybe, this is our person and we found our lobster, as friends would say. So if the thing that you desire is terrifying you simultaneously, that's what I would pay attention to. And I don't mean terrifying like it has the ability to be harmful, because let's be real, all things do. But if that's the primary, like, oh man, this is going to, like, we're almost speaking factually about a fear, that's when it's the anti, at least for me. So, because it's the thing that your instinct wants. So why is the first moment that we're going for it replacing an obstacle? Mm. It's counterintuitive.
Okay, that's kind of what I thought. I do like people, but I have to have limited time with them.
Yeah.
Right. Well, there's the introverted element as well, right? You gain energy from your solo time. So multifaceted. There's a lot going on.
So let's take the next question. So for those of you that want to go longer, I can, but Spencer can't.
I can go a smidge longer, but not a whole lot longer.
All right. I wanted to ask about the concept that you had where you said of the tritypes, each one has its wing and it makes up a multitude of tritypes. You mentioned it on one of the Ben Basselin streams, like Jonathan has 6 based on his wings. If you were to say 9, 5, 4, then you can have 2, 4, 6, or 8. And I think I'm one that may have 8.
Yeah, well, 5 has a natural line of connection to 8. And if you...
Oh, no, I meant 8 different...
sorry. Okay. Yeah, so what you do, it's a little harder for those of you that have a 3, 6, or 9 in your tritype. But if you have all 3, you're connected to all types, and it gives you a sensitivity to all types, but fewer ways of handling problems. That sounds a little confusing, but the hexad types, the 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, and 7, are more individualistic, more specialized. The 3, 6, and 9 really identify with each other more than another type. So you have the 3 in there. You're the 5, 1, 3. And then what wing would you?
5 wing 6, 1 wing 9, and a 3 wing 4.
Okay, so all I'm doing is working with numerology, and we're the 5 W6 and the
1 wing 9 and the 3 wing 4.
So what we end up with is, of course, the 513 tritype would be the lead because it's the dominant. But of secondary influence to know of the 27 tritypes what you use in the key. Some people have 8. Some people have really just their own if they don't identify with the wings. So don't force a wing. It's more that you have to look at it. So if we put these numbers together any way at all, of course, he has the 513. He has the 613. And then he has the 514 and the 369 and the 469 and the 146 and the 549. Did I already get that? Oh, you have a lot with that combination. What am I missing? So all I'm looking at is he has 2 types, 2 gut types when his wing is dominant. Sometimes 9s don't identify with one wing or the other, 3s as well, and 6s. But if what we tend to do is identify with the wing type that matches us better, meaning if you're an extrovert, you're going to identify with the extroverted wing. And if you're an introverted, you're going to identify with the introverted wing. Now, in truth, we all use both wings all the time because it's like machinery. The type goes out to a wing and back, out to the other wing and back, like a little machine. So it's got to go out and back, but it's doing it one at a time, really fast. And at the same time, from the type, it's going to a line of connection and back, line of connection and back. And those are 8 movements. And then you have the type that it's based on, and that's the 9th. So this is a pattern of 9s, a system of 9s. So we have to always end up with 9, 6, or 3. If we have something that's based on 5 variables, it doesn't quite work because this is a trialectic system. But I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which I did forget one.
This just came to my attention a couple of years ago. I took the Riso Hudson test, and after I took it and looked at the spread, I, on my own, went over and was going over multiple tritypes, and then I heard you say that in the stream, and I was like, okay.
Yeah, no, it is true. So, and then of these 8, you'd want to then stack them. You'd want to, just like we do everything else, you'd want to say, okay, you use 513 the most, then what's underneath that and underneath that and underneath that? What the wing does is it gives us a kind of a little clue as to what we probably use in a secondary way for our 3 types in the tritype. And the 369, they just go to everything. But some people have, like I have an 8 with a 7 wing and a 7 with an 8 wing. So I have fewer numbers that I use. And some people say, well, you do so much research and everything. Aren't you a 5 in head center? And that's one of my tritypes, of course, is rather than 4, because my 4 has a 5 wing. Yeah. So that is one of my tritypes. And I have a line there. So 854 is right up there, ready to help me out whenever I need it. But where am I most uncertain and confident at the same time? With the 874. So yes. Anything else I can say to that, Peter? Because I'm glad you asked that. I teach it in the advanced classes.
You're saying that the more you have, the harder you are to type?
Yep.
That's all.
That's why 6s struggle so much, especially when 6 and 9 are in the tritype. They never can approach any testing instrument with ease because they're trying to figure out what the test wants, how it'll be used. Could it be used to hurt them in some way? They don't know if it's going to a machine or a person. So they're trying to test the test. And that is because fundamentally the 6's defense strategy is to conceal their insecurities. So exposing their fear, they can't even expose it to themselves unless they're really phobic and they know they're afraid. But people who know nothing about the Enneagram will admit to fear. But if you know this much about the Enneagram, you won't anymore if you're a 6. It's like it has to become a secret because it would put you at risk.
Double secret probation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. All right. So I just have 2 quick questions. I really love this talk, by the way. This was really awesome and informative. My first question is, since Tritype is working with 3 types, how can we use that for growth? So my core type is a 4, but my other 2 types are 7 and 9. So I read an Enneagram 4 book, and it talks about integration to 1. Could I also grow as a person from integrating my 7 to a 5 or my 9 to a 3? Should I do that should I learn more about the other 2 types and then kind of employ strategies for those?
Absolutely. And more importantly, when you know about the other types, then you, just like we did with the wings, you want to see what's canceled out. So with 4, 7, 9, what you have to do is not show your pain and suffering as much as you want to, because it makes people pull away from you. That's the way the 4, 7, 9 feels. Now, they usually don't have the ENFP, but when they do, it is the happier 4. The 4 identified with potentially bringing happiness rather than feeling it. 4 with 7 in the Tritype does bring a search for happiness. But what happens is that if people know you to be that kind person that is sensitive and caring, if you then start displaying the unpopular aspects of envy, then people are going to go, whoa, I thought you were this kind of a person. And then the 4 will feel rejected, showing their full self, because of course, envy is a defense strategy to feeling inadequate. So you want to make something else inadequate so you can feel neutral. It's actually a good defense strategy. It just doesn't work well with others, if that makes sense. So if you're truly the 4, 7, 9, that would be a real dilemma for you.
Okay.
But you need to know that you would have also, in addition to a fear of being inadequate, flawed, and defective, you would also fear being inferior and trapped or limited. And you would have a fear of being without love, lovelessness. Either you can't feel love, or you don't have love, or you can't express love. There'll be some obstacle in the way. And that you would fear being shut out. So I find it's best to take the core fears of the 3 types, because that integration disintegration was an error. Naranjo said he was misquoted, and he never taught that you integrate to one type over the other. Your lines of connection are always operating. So if you're integrating to the high side of the whole system. If you're disintegrating to the whole side of each type in your Tritype, of the wing types, all of it. So I think it's really important for that to be out there. Unfortunately, most books have some form of integration, disintegration, or stress and security. But it was an error in 1971 that was disseminated through 2 particular teachings. and people just don't realize it. And then if you read all these books with it, then you think it's real. But look at the area of integration when you're disintegrating, because you're doing both. I have 5 and as my line and 2 as my line. I can research, that's high side of 5. And I can be needy, and that's deemed the positive side, my line to 2. No, but how does it show up? For me, it'll show up by not taking care of myself. So my friends or family will step in to help me because I won't ask for help. So that's a type of neediness of 2. So yes, just that'll shift your perspective more than any other thing if you understand that. But you have to look at 1 and 2.
Okay. So take growth strategies from both arrows rather than just, and also I can do that for all 3 of my types, right? 4,
Absolutely.
7. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
And thank you. And just one more question. So like earlier when you were talking about trauma, especially for a 4, like when they maybe encounter like a response or something that triggers that trauma response again, it'll be like reliving the same thing again. So it's like if you go to trauma therapy or something, you said, I'm just trying to clarify, you said that wouldn't be like an ideal strategy of just going back to that situation, or?
Thank you for asking that. If someone specializes in trauma, that therapy is probably going to be very good. But if someone doesn't know the Enneagram, they can miss opportunities to help the person heal. And in my experience, people do not heal as rapidly as they do when you use the type and the tritype and the instinct, because you get the specific need that will help with that process. So I don't mean to imply that trauma therapy doesn't work. I just feel like there are way too many missed opportunities. And you can accidentally put someone that has synesthesia back in the traumatic experience, the PTSD of it. And that's possible anyhow. How do you experience it, Spencer?
And just, this is the last question I have time for. I got to hop over to this. So I focus specifically on the tritype in general. And your tritype is kind of widespread. You've got a number, you've got 4 that actually wants to go to the feeling. And then you got the polarity of the 9, where it's like, if I could just kind of wait this out, maybe the feeling will go. And then I can lift my head back up. I call it ostriching, where like once I lift my head back up, maybe everything will be fine again. And then you got the 7 that wants good vibes, good times, but in order to feel good, might need to address that. So your 4 needs to know that you can go here and it'll be safe. Your 7 needs to know that we can bring it up but back out at any time. And your 9 needs to know I'm not going to push you there. Because the more you push a 9, the more a 9 digs its feet into the ground. It's like, go ahead, try and move me. It's not going to happen. So it's recognizing, okay, this tritype as a whole wants to go there, but also feels conflicted about going there. So it's understanding that, like, it's, for me personally, whenever I work with this type, I make it clear before we go into it, hey, my intention is to really go this and nurture this. And because you lead with 4, I'm going to really try to nurture your 4. But I want to let your 7 and 9 know that at any point we can pull back. And you can know at any point that you're right. I'm very client-centered, so I let my clients decide the speed and the momentum that we do things. And we can dabble that in. And if I don't hear you talk about it, I'm going to check in, because your 9 and your 7 aren't going to want to talk about it. And your 4 is going to be quietly suffering over here if the other 2 are in charge. So again, I really focus on the numbers that are involved, because 1/3 of you is going to feel neglected. The needs aren't going to be met because I can't fully authentically go there, because the 9 has too many memories of finally letting all the emotions out and everyone getting so caught off guard that's like, oh, not doing that again. And, going to the negative, which is going to heavy feelings for a 7. is not being in this like good, positive vibes. Well, at least.
Painful.
Yeah, exactly. The go-to phrase for a 7 is at least. One of my favorite phrases I ever heard from one of my 7 clients. It was a couple session, and he turns to her and says, well, at least you have legs, right? That was his way of helping her understand that there are bigger things going on than what is happening between them two. So it's that understanding of what each one of those numbers needs to feel safe to fully go there. And when all the planets are aligned, the 9 knows they're not going to be forced. The 7 knows they can bounce out at any time. And the 4 knows they can fully express and they won't be judged or attacked. When all those are aligned, now we can go there and we can leave whenever we need.
Excellent, Spencer. I totally agree. I do it with micro expressions, which you do too.
Very helpful.
That's the way I'm client-centered. So if I see an expression of distress,
check in, of course.
With a smile, it needs to be explored. But I won't keep anyone in the trauma.
Mm-mm.
And I will take a piece of it and then work with it, because I don't feel like people feel better if their trauma is triggered. It just makes it, it's like triggering PTSD in that moment. But 4s will be attracted to, 4s and 6s are attracted to going into the thing that hurt them and talking about it. And when they talk about it, they're creating a story that's so ingrained that is hurtful to them.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Spencer, for being on this with me and even going over.
Of course. Thank you all for having me. Yeah, it's always a blast. Have a good one, everybody.
Hi, Spencer. I wish you were going to still be here, but I will carry on for a few more minutes. All righty.
Thank you. That was great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Niall. Nicole.
So good. Yeah, Niall, you're awesome. And actually,
you too.
Yeah, well, you're more important than you know, because you kind of tie into my hopefully final question. The presence and practice of minorities in Enneagrammic work, and now with trityping, ethnic minorities specifically in Enneagrammic work, and now even with trityping, which I've been for like a year now trying to get as much information as possible. And it's been transformative. And yes, approaching my spiritual practices through my trityping, Niall, to further testify to what you're talking about. It works. It works. It works. That's all I have to say about that. But
yeah, because it identifies your sense of purpose, the holy idea and the holy virtue.
Yes,
and your tritype say how you're going to manage and what you're going to want.
Everything. It unearths everything. And it's so painfully, delightfully good, as the 6 and the 4 in me love. And the 8 is like, can we hurry up and get this meditation time over with? So anyway, but to my question, have you noticed in your research, in your coaching and teaching, any difference between, and this is such a broad question, I hope I don't offend anyone with this, but have you noticed any specific differences or subtle ones between what may be the ethnic minority experience of their Enneagrammic typing, especially when it comes to masquerading and that sort of thing, compared to the white experience within America? It's very specific here. This question is super relevant to me, especially over the last 2 years. We've had so many issues between racial divides, ethnic diversity, the whole nine. And consequently, conversations have gone up, which have been excellent. But in talking with many of my minority friends, family, acquaintances, many of their experiences when it comes to wings, when it comes to instincts, you actually already killed one of the beasts there when you were talking about the disintegration, integration thing. I was trying to explain that to someone the other day, and I did not know, Katherine, you just educated me tonight, that was a mistake, because I was telling them that something about that whole system didn't seem right, and I had already rejected it, typical 8 style. And I had just said, that can't possibly be right. As far as I could see, you do have the ability, if your spiritual strength is up, to choose what is going to be my strategy for coping with XYZ. So you helped me get some clinical behind that. Thanks. I can't wait to hit them with that. But I am sensing that we may be, as the colloquial statement has gone, oh, we're living in two different Americas. We're experiencing two different Americas. I feel like we might be experiencing two different Enneagrams too. But I don't know.
Something really important, and that is I've taught to all minorities, whether it was just through corporations or through individual clients or teaching in jails, beginning in that same time period, 1995. And so I've worked with, people from that are culturally a certain color, but it's not the color. It's, again, it's like, what race were you, and were you in an environment that validated your race, creed, or color? And if we are, and gender, we have to throw gender in,
yes,
because there are two Americas in terms of gender as well. And if you think about the founding fathers, they were very 1 and 7. Like I think Jefferson was 7, because the right for the pursuit of happiness, having that in the Bill of Rights is very much a 7 value. But the structure of this country and the regulations and the rules, the ruling aspect is very type 1. And then our captains of industry nature and being the best, seeing ourselves as the best, is type 3. And wanting the diversity and, 30 types of mustard or 31 flavors of ice cream. Just the concept is very type 7. So we are a 3-7-1 culture. So looking at it in terms of Tritype gives us more of an understanding of the way we do or don't fit in. So because we value the 3 as the lead, all of us have some of that 3 imprinting, because to be in school in the US and other countries that have 3, we're going to be impacted by it. And if you happen to be a type that is the opposite of 3, which you have, and I have, then it's hard to want to follow that idea of success. We're going to have our own idea of what that means. We're going to have a different pursuit. We're not going to want that structure of 1. We're not going to want the limitations of the 7. In my Tritype, I'm not going to want those limitations. But I grew up in Newport Beach, which is a very 7-3-1 culture. So even our communities, our culture. So if we think about the culture overall of minorities within the Enneagram, there weren't enough people whose voice was heard until recently. They're more of a kind of an outreach, or people are teaching in more areas. So they are now gaining the same experience I've had, because if you wanted Tritype, you had to get to me. So I have an international clientele. But a lot of what I might teach, others might not know, just simply because if they were teaching in the US to a particular group of people or a particular ideology, then a lot is going to be missed. So religion makes a difference, whether you see yourself in one religion or non-denominational, that's a factor. So when I did my research, I looked at all of that. And I always ask the type and how certain you are. And allow for comments. I'm doing a study right now, by the way, on empathy. It doesn't look like it's a study on empathy, but it is, because I'm asking you your empathy style and I'm giving you 9 versions of it. So please do that, because even if you just say you're unsure of your type, that helps me. You don't have to have certainty, but the way you answer will be meaningful because I collect all that data. I collect everything. So when I was working with minorities, there was more of an avoidance in answering that question because they did not want to be judged by being a minority. But yet, I need the minority voice in every given situation and the minorities within the minorities to understand what is true across the board. So in my first research, after I had, 400 as my beginning group, I then went and found 100 people that knew nothing about the Enneagram, would never want to know about the Enneagram, and persuaded them to do an interview with me so that I could have a baseline of not just people to be interested in typologies, but those who wouldn't.
Right.
So I asked Myers-Briggs. Now I'm expanding it to empathy style, but I needed people to have a rough idea of the differences. But there are many more categories. So if what you're asking me is if you're fairly represented, no. But does the Enneagram vary according to race, creed, or color? No. But are we accepted as individuals equally? No.
Yeah.
And gender, like people who say, well, a male ate this or a female ate that. Yeah, like some people would say, oh, you don't have a feminine woman on the 8 card. Like it won't bother an 8. But it will bother people that aren't 8s that want to be 8s. They'll say, well, I don't identify. But even that word identify kind of gets us in trouble. But the 8s know what they do. They don't need a beautiful exemplar, even if they have 4 in the Tritype, because we can make fun of ourselves. And it makes us a little uneasy if we want to be seen that way, because it's not, we don't have the full way of being. So that's where gender can modify how the world sees us, not our internal way of viewing the world. So the world doesn't like a female 8. We're too outspoken. They like a 9 or a 2 in women. So that's a bigger prejudice, to tell you the truth.
I
Same thing with the sensitive males. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Which that's a whole other topic. Everything you're saying is ringing so amazingly true. And you are correct with the archetypal visual being on the card probably would have been a turnoff, because automatically that kind of reads as a control. Like, okay, you're already, we're 2 minutes into this test and you're already trying to box me in. That's not why I'm here. But I grew up, well, I'm the daughter of a pastor, but we were missionaries within predominantly white spaces all my life. I went to an all-white school, had all-white church, ministered on, and it was fundamentalist, which now fundamentalism is evangelicalism, which is a whole bunch of other stuff. We're all over the place. So, and being a female 8 in that context, and then being able to now, through this tool, married with my spirituality, has been able to uncover a lot of things. So these topics are constantly surfacing in my conversations with my female friends, with my ethnically marginalized friends, not so much with my white male friends. I try to ease into it, but they feel a little uneasy sometimes, except my artist friends, those who are musicians and artists and that sort of thing. They're all about this.
The intellectuals are interested. Yeah.
So, in pursuit of this, I guess I would ask this question: how can I? Oh, I'm being so stereotypical tonight. I'm sorry, Katherine. How can I best advocate for women, ethnic minorities, when it comes to Enneagrammic work? How can I best serve to, I don't know, make space for these new experiences in such an incredibly conservative context?
Well, it's tough, but I've taught in that context because the idea is that the 9 types were the 7 deadly sins plus 2.
Plus
Fear,
right.
fear and vanity. And so that's how the error disseminated around the world as it went through the Catholic Church. And that's because Robert Oakes, who was on sabbatical in 71, met and studied with Naranjo, liked that conversation. And Naranjo said, well, it might be possible that it's harder to go one way than the other. It might be easier to drop into our fixation one way, and the higher side of it might be harder. And it was discussed in a study group. And I had this personal conversation with Naranjo. So I'm not repeating hearsay. I'm repeating what I actually experienced, because I found that it didn't work. And especially after 400 people, for sure it didn't work. And then when it kept climbing, I didn't meet him till 96. And I also gave him my subtype research, which he validated. He was actually very pleased because I was validating his hypothesis. I wasn't trying to do that. I was just trying to discover more about the instincts. And then I couldn't find anyone really that could discuss my 3 types, but he did discuss it with me and thought, well, if there's 3 subtypes, there might be, but he never really stated, yes, that's true, but he explored it. And I really appreciate that. But I got away from answering you. The way to make it easier is to help them recognize their true type, is what I call it. And that's the accurate tritype stacked in the right order and the right instinctual order stacking. And because the core fear plus the instinctual type fear coming together creates our focus of attention. So if you do that with all 3 types in your tritype, you'll know exactly what the person is going to be thinking and feeling, and then getting into trouble with themselves or others because of it. And I find that in that conservative world, just like when I taught in business, I couldn't say the sexual instinct.
Right.
Like in any government, anytime I would teach in a government, US government oriented place, they can't even mention it. You can't even mention spirituality. So there's a way to get around it. Spirited, or inspired by this or that. There's a way to get around anything. But I'm just saying that you with your tritype should be able to find a way to help them touch on the truth of it. Because we all recognize truth when we hear it. If it's explained to us in a way that it matches our reality. And that's why the types give us translation tools. If we happen to be the same tritype, there isn't a need for it. But if we're not, we need to adjust that part the way the type needs to hear it, see it, experience it. So you can teach in the most fundamental structures, but you have to find a way around what's threatening and language it a little differently for the group you're teaching to. And just think of it as a translation tool. But once people land on it accurately, it's a relief, and they kind of then feel uncomfortable about the way they handled situations in the past.
The phrase you just used there, translation tool, is incredibly helpful.
Any style was one of the first research I did a lot. I wrote 2 books in 1995, and any style was based on the internal experience of type and the language they use. So some words are more easily natural, as though we were from different countries speaking different languages. So each Enneagram type is its own country.
That helps so much, because otherwise it does feel like, bait and switch. It feels like not being fully, not disclosing the truth teller is just going nuts. Like, just rip the Band-Aid off and let them know what it is. But translating is much more grace-filled. And that's
helpful. And the truth teller needs to know when is the right time to tell the truth. That's the hardest thing, to have 3 visceral types, the visceral type in each center. And that's why it's an issue. I have just a few more minutes. Josh, thank you. Can I maybe answer it? I have to leave literally.
Yeah, keep it short and keep the point.
Yeah.
I cut out all the background. The essence of it is, you've used the word a couple of times which I've never heard before in relation to the 7 position inferiority. And then there I'm at the tip of the 1. And I'm just wondering that in relation to inadequacy in the direction of movements on the lines. I do a lot of inner work on the lines, all over the lines. And that piece particularly is a blind spot for me because of stuff to do with my grandfather. He was a 7 and stuff on that side. But I've never actually heard that before, inferiority at 7. To me, I just get a sense of, I want to distract, I want to move away. But I don't know whether I'm at position 1 or whether I'm at position 7. It can take me quite a while to realize, for whatever reason, the instinct says, oh, I'm here at 4 or oh, I'm here at 7. To me, they kind of seem like merged. If that makes sense. Could you clarify the difference between the inferiority at 7 and the inadequacy at 4?
Yes, the inferiority at 7 is momentary. So 7s are egalitarians until someone makes them inferior. And then the 7 rises up and makes the other, or the situation that made them feel inferior, they make them inferior. But it isn't what they hold on to. Whereas the 4 inadequacy is omnipresent, that you fundamentally don't have something you should have to make it in the world. And no matter how much you decorate it or define your image based on qualities that you'd like to have, they're gone in a second if the inadequacy comes up. If someone has something that you're good at and another thing you're not good at, it's so automatic and it's forever. Whereas the core fears are forever, but because of the 7 dancing, they don't even know it's inferiority that they're triggered by.
It's an experience in 7, but it's a internal.
Image. It's
internal at 4. Mm-hmm. So I suppose because the 4s are drawn, the 7's assertive. So this is more about shame at 4. So that's more I am missing. Whereas at 7, the experience is missing. That might be a good cue.
Yeah. So and the 4 notices what's missing, and the 7 has a fear of what's missing, that they'll miss something. And the 4 is pointing out what's missing. Now, the 7 can do that once they're in the situation and it's boring, then they miss the opportunity to go to another event that might not have been boring. Or they have 3 obligations the same day. They try to hold them loosely and do the one they feel like the day of the event, or try to do all 3. Whereas the 4 is like consolidated into an image and cultivated an image. They like raw and authentic, but the minute they've cultivated it, it begins to be sophistry. And within each type, there's a dichotomy. And this is from Ichazo too, the dichotomies. And they're just extraordinary because within each type, there's a dichotomy. So within the 7, it's like inferior, superior. And like within the 5, it's social, antisocial. What are you going to be in any given situation? So they're all important. I really wish I had more time for that one because that's very rich. All these questions are actually. Problem is, I have so many years of it, and I want to give you all of it. But I will do this again. I know Spencer's game, and he's just such a compliment to me because we grew up. Listen to me. We grew up as 8s. I did earlier than he did. But I also had an 8 father. He had an 8 mother. 8ness was okay. But in my case, I was teaching him how to not suffer as much as I did as an 8. So he went on to become a therapist and use all the material he learned of the typologies that I gathered over the years. So it's a very complementary way of teaching, in my opinion. So
the inferior superior clicked with me because I thought, the 7 could have a kind of a braggadocious quality, and it's assertive, and yet it's this childlike, innocence, everything's about fun, but I could get this sense of it's camouflage.
Yeah.
And that's why it struck me twice in 2 different conversations. Used word inferiority. It's like, I've never heard that word used for 7 before. For whatever reason, I thought, it makes a lot of sense. So it's very useful.
And it's fundamental to 7, avoiding being inferior. Needing to be cool, like all people might want to be cool or hip or whatever. But for the 7, if you aren't, it's devastating. So I'm past having to go.
Okay,
thank you all so much. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye, wherever you're off.